Hey, math friends, welcome to week 4 of our Figuring Out Fluency book study. We are going to be talking all about chapter 5, but this week is going to look just slightly different. So, I am actually out of town, so I am pre recording this, but we are still going to be chatting all about chapter 5. I pre recorded an interview with Rosalba. Rosalba is one of the co authors to the companion books. So, we've got this main Figuring Out Fluency book that we are reading together, but then there's also these companion books, which are excellent. And they dive a whole lot deeper into a specific domain and how the principles within the main Figuring Out Fluency book apply to these different domains. So she's one of those co-authors, and I was able to get with her before the book study started, and we chatted all about chapter 5 and talked about the different modifications or applications for the ideas in chapter 5 and how we can make that what that looks like in an upper elementary math classroom. So we aren't going to do Q&A this week because obviously I wasn't able to see your questions before I met with Rosalba and had this conversation. But this interview is a little bit longer, and so that will be the bulk of our time together tonight. It is fantastic. I hope you enjoy it. Someone from Team Mix and Math will be live with you in the comments to answer your questions and support you if you are here watching live together with other teachers tonight. And if not, if you are watching the replay. But I really do hope that you enjoy my conversation with Rosalba, and I look forward to being back with you live next week. Rosalba, thank you so much for joining me to chat about chapter 5 of Figuring Out Fluency. I'm so glad that you were able to join me for this.
Yeah, I thank you so much for having me. I love talking about this stuff, so I feel like it's going to be a great combo.
Yes, and we're talking all about automaticity, which I
Yeah.
think that there are a lot of misconceptions or confusion about what automaticity is. And this chapter did such a great job of making it very clear about what it is, what it isn't, and how we move students towards being automatic with those facts. So
Yeah.
I thought I would kick us off with a quote that I had highlighted here. It's on page 108. And it says, automaticity is the ability to complete a task with little or no attention to process. Little thought, if any, is given to skills that are automatic. They appear intuitive or reflexive. I know that is what we want for our students, right? Like we want them to be automatic with those facts.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what lies here is a misconception that automaticity is always kind of linked to speed and recall, which we do want students to have, but it's the matter of which we go about it, right? Because there are automaticity um strategies and things like that in place that I don't know if we're seeing enough in the classroom, right? Because we're seeing that as like the outdated kind of version of automaticity as being fast. So we do things
Mhm.
like give a lot of fact tests and speed fact tests in order to build that when there are a variety of ways to address automaticity. And at the end of the day, automaticity always kind of falls back to fluency. And I think even before kind of getting into automaticity, every teacher should have a real solid understanding of what fluency means. And because even that has so many misconceptions around it, honestly. Um, and I'm not sure if you've talked about this from the other chapters, but fluency has three main components. You know, anybody reading the book will come across that in these chapters. Obviously, flexibility, efficiency, and accuracy. Um, where I think sometimes, we kind of, I don't want to say miss the mark, but again, it's just like our traditional way of teaching and where we have to shift educationally, but is the procedural fluency piece, which we talk about a lot in this, or John and Jenny did a great job talking about that procedural fluency piece in this chapter, right? Because that was always linked also to speed and recall. But procedural fluency is so much deeper than that, right? When we're
Yeah.
thinking about speed, we're prioritizing like quick answers, right? But what happens is there tends to be a lack of conceptual understanding behind that. So it's not enough to say quick anymore. And I think immediately when we hear the words either procedure or fluency or even automaticity, we link it to really being fast, but we have to make sure there's an understanding behind that.
Yeah. And, on that same page on 108,
Mhm.
there is this, it's a graphic. What would you call that? not like a pyramid. What do they call that? Do you see it?
Oh, is it the stack pyramid, the
Yes,
phases?
there we
Is
go.
that one?
Yes. Okay, the
Yes,
phases.
the
And
basic
so,
fact, yeah.
yes. And so I think a lot of times we jump to what we want. The goal is that phase three, is that mastery, that automaticity. And there is a
Yeah,
section in here that talks about the fact that a lot of times we skip phase two, which is the
yeah,
strategies, which is the understanding. We go from
correct.
this counting and the skip counting to all of a sudden, trying to get students to be automatic with these facts. And without the strategies, really the only way we can get them to be automatic, though it's not really, is
Mhm.
memorization. And so we almost have to like backtrack and be like, oh, wait, let's not skip phase two. Let's spend a lot of time in phase two because that is what, actually, I did pull this quote. It said, page 110, automaticity is an outcome of learning concepts and strategies mixed with abundant exposure and practice.
Absolutely. Practice is a big deal. I do want to talk about that, especially with the activities that are in this chapter. But something you said about memorization is key here. These phases are really important. And what I'm seeing, and I think many of us do, again, because it's like that traditional model that we've always followed, we stay very long in that first phase of counting. And we 100% tend to skip, or maybe not even skip, but breeze through phase two, which is that derived section. And we do want them straight into automaticity. But when we breeze through that phase two section, the derived section, we do heavily emphasize rote memorization for the kids, for our students. And as we know, when we're having students, even if it's unintentionally rote, promote rote memorization, we're really just asking them to mimic us, right? We're really just saying, like, here's how this works. You try it, you do it. And then we think that if they practice that enough, that they do have that deeper understanding, when that's not really the case. And we see that when it comes to efficiency, which is the other part of fluency, one of the three main components of fluency. It's very difficult for students to be efficient when they don't have those derived fact strategies because they're memorizing. So it's very difficult for them to choose which of these strategies would be most efficient for me to solve this problem, because they're not thinking of the variety of ways, derived ways that they can approach that. So that
Yeah.
comes along where we do want students to have basic facts in their long-term memory, right? Where they can pull it out quick, because the whole point of having them stored in their bank is because they have to get to problems that have a higher cognitive demand. And if they're stuck on 8+7 and it has nothing to do with the problem, it's only one basic component of the problem, they're going to be stuck there and can't move on to the things that demand a higher cognitive, thinking, right? And we see that quite often. So we tend to say, well, kids don't have number sense. They can't do this. We like to blame things on number sense a lot overall. Like, they don't have number sense. But I think it's really important to be specific about what about number sense in particular are students not lacking, but haven't reached yet, right? Is
Yeah.
it that, they're having difficulty? That counting phase is really important. Are they stuck in that area? Are they stuck in some of these um procedural automaticity standards that we want students to have, like doubling and things like that? Like, we have to be very specific on what students need without just saying they lack this, right? They can't solve this higher cognitive demand problem because they don't get the concept. Maybe they do get the concept, but they're stuck on that basic fact level, right? So
Yeah.
we want it stored in long term, but we got to make sure that they get the thing.
Yeah. So I have a couple of thoughts. One, I think we all have the same goal. Like
Of course.
we want that quick recall. We want that like long term they know the fact. Because
Mhm.
especially with in upper elementary, that's what the majority of the teachers in the book study are in upper elementary
Yeah.
education. And on page 112, it says automaticity frees up students to reason about more complex ideas. And we see that
Yeah.
in our third, fourth, and fifth grade classrooms where they are working with more complex ideas and they don't have those basic facts. And that gets in the way. It makes it really hard for them to, work on grade level content. And so we see this problem here. We see, okay, this is where this would be so much easier if students had this, but they're not there yet. But I don't think like procedural fluency or just fluency in general is talked about enough. And so this book has given us such a great guide to say, okay, now we see this problem. Here's how we fix it. Here's what they're missing. I think even just this chart on 108, where we can say, okay, they're not at phase 3.
Mhm.
Here are the things that we can start diving into. Like, have they
Correct.
mastered phase 1? Like, can they skip count? Like, if we're even just talking about, like, I love the idea of bringing skip counting into upper elementary, skip counting by decimals, skip counting by fractions. Can they
Yeah.
do that? Okay, yes or no? Can they? Do they have any strategies to be flexible with larger whole numbers and fractions and decimals? So I think that we see the problem, and now going through this book, we kind of have like a roadmap for, okay, these are the different things we can do to kind of like bridge to the solution, if that makes
Yeah,
sense.
absolutely, absolutely, and I think what's important with this, you nailed it with what you're saying, is doing formative assessments along the way, right? So, I know hearing the word assessments is scary, and I don't mean time tests, and I don't mean any of that, but just really looking at your students, observing them, and seeing, "Okay, if we're on phase 1 right now, what can I do to move them forward? What can I do to support them?" Right? And the derived facts section, which is phase 2, which is really heavy and really important, um, let's say they come into your grade level because you are upper elementary, but they are having difficulty. Maybe they did not have this in previous grade levels. Maybe they don't remember, whatever it is. Maybe it was like a short term memory thing. They kind of learned it, forgot about it, moved on. If you're upper elementary, I think it's really important to make sure that you're revisiting these stages. Not that phase 1 is for little guys, or little kiddos, and then phase 2 is, for this certain grade or age level. Absolutely not. I think we all have to address all 3 phases and make sure, especially in upper elementary, that the whole numbers are solid. Because if the whole numbers are not solid, fractions and decimals will be a nightmare. It will be very
Yeah.
difficult. And we see that nowadays. We see that decimal and fraction concepts are really difficult. I'm going to even say not for students, but even for adults.
Oh, for
It is,
sure.
we see that in life. Fractions really, it scares grown people. So, in order to have students kind of have that fluidity, they really need to make sure that the whole numbers are down pat, right? So even if it's upper elementary, we have to concentrate on those 3 phases regardless.
Yeah. And what's interesting that you're talking about the fact that we've got to make sure we're there with whole numbers. One of the things that I love about this book and one of the reasons that I chose this book is because a lot of times, I'll get messages from teachers and they're like, but my students are at like a kindergarten level. My 5th grade students are at a kindergarten level, which first off, I have lots of just thoughts about statements, blanket statements like that
Yeah.
anyway.
Yeah.
But let's just like lean into that for a second. This book shows how, like, I think it's on page 113 where they're listing the 8 automaticities we want students to have.
Mhm.
These are things that are helpful in kindergarten all the way through 6th, 7th, 8th, and beyond. And so when you're talking about whole numbers, fractions, and decimals, like the examples that they show about like using 25s, we can talk about using 25s with whole numbers, but that same thing, that same uh, um, automaticity, or what are they calling it? The 7 significant strategies. No,
Are you
that's
on
what
127? Can we actually
113.
You're on 113, okay.
I forget the name. There's like a chapter that's all about like there's like utilities and strategies and
Yeah.
automaticities, but whatever the word is for what they have listed on 113, those things are helpful with whole numbers, but we can apply that same thinking to decimals when we're talking about
Yeah.
25 hundredths.
Absolutely. I would love to actually, if you have a second, go
Yeah,
through it. Or teachers are reading this, reading this book along the way, but I would love to actually talk about each one. And
let's
if
do it.
possible, have the teachers just think about how that strategy, the procedural automaticity strategy, how it applies to their grade level, but also what younger, lower elementary teachers would also need because everything in math is interconnected, right?
Mhm.
Everything. We know this. So I would love, if possible, to kind of go through
Let's
all
do
8,
it.
not in depth, but just I want teachers to reflect on that if possible. Think about where you're at, what your students need, and then what they needed before that you could possibly kind of fill in that gap for them.
Yeah.
Is that
Okay.
cool?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, let's kick
Okay.
it off with breaking apart all numbers through 10. What are
Yeah,
your thoughts on that?
exactly. Okay, so let's talk about that. So break apart is one of the most foundational strategies that you can possibly have because if you think about it, we're using it in multiplication, we're using it for decomposition, composition. So if you think about break apart all numbers through 10, yes, you're thinking about basic numbers, right? Whole numbers. But how does that apply to decimals and how does that apply to fractions? That's super important as well, right? We know that composition and decomposition are really important for students to understand with those concepts in general. So if we're doing it early on, right, with basic numbers, those break apart, 7 and 3 make 10, 6 and 4 make 10. Well, what does that mean when we're talking about decimals in one whole?
Mhm.
How many tenths and how many tenths make that whole?
Yeah.
Because once you throw a decimal in place, students start thinking, these aren't real numbers now, right?
Right.
That decimal in place or even fractions, right? When we want to make a whole with fractions, well, what does that look like when I break one whole apart? You know what I mean? Obviously, a half and a half students pick up as early as kindergarten, thinking about a half and a half make this whole.
Yeah.
But then when it gets a little bit more complex as students get older, especially if they're working with mixed numbers and things like that, again, it's just a whole transition all the way through. So I love for teachers to think about and even yeah, like lower elementary teachers to think about this too. I know right now it's upper elementary, reading this book and talking about it, but it's so important for lower elementary teachers to see where's this progression going?
Yeah.
Because if I'm a lower elementary teacher and I'm not discussing half and half make a whole, it's going to create a gap for our students. That's going to hinder them along the road. So breaking apart is a big deal in our math world, and we gotta do it.
Yeah, and I think it's really good even in upper elementary. So one of the things that I like a hill I will die on is starting in working with students is starting with something that they know so that
Mhm,
they have that that like a moment of confidence and then building onto that and like connecting back to that, right? Because all new learning is built upon previous understanding. So with that break apart strategy, even in upper elementary, thinking about like, okay, how did they use this in lower grades in a way that they're confident with? Let's start there and be like, okay, so maybe it is like breaking apart 10. Okay, great.
mhm.
Well, how does this same strategy work when we're breaking apart 1,000 or when we're breaking apart one whole? Like, how can you approach these in similar ways?
Yeah,
And so I think that even having students be able to see, oh, I already know something about this. Now we're just
mhm.
applying it in a different way to a different set of numbers. So that breaking apart and then really the base 10 combinations
Yeah, I was
is,
gonna say that. That's just decomposition, so it's
yes.
more of the same. One is within 10, which is a benchmark that we really need students to know, and the other is just regular decomposition of all numbers. So that applies to, again, moving from whole numbers to fractions to everything. I wanna touch on something that you had said that the hill you wanna die on, which I totally agree with you. I'm on the same page. But I just wanna mention something that kind of is important with what you mentioned when students have success. It's been shown that when you start students off with that little bit of success, something they already know, it actually helps them with productive struggle right after, with perseverance right after. So if you just throw something at a kid and you say, okay, let's persevere through this. You got this. We're seeing that a lot of students give up quite easily. I mean, it's happened in every classroom. I've been a teacher forever. Like we've all been there where we give
Yeah.
something to a student and they go, okay, I automatically don't want to see this. Please get this out of
Yep.
my
They
face.
automatically shut down.
They
Like,
shut down. They got to go to the bathroom, to the nurse. They gotta do all the things aside from the actual task. But it's been shown that if students are given that piece of success right before, when the difficult thing comes up right after, they're more likely to sit through it, right? Because we're
mhm.
building it's really basically reducing the math anxiety that naturally comes along when something is difficult, right?
Yeah.
You can apply that to anything in our own lives. When we do something that we know is quite difficult, but we meet some success before even attempting it, we feel like we can tackle it, right?
Yeah.
So I just wanted to mention that to what you're saying. I totally agree. And there's research behind that that shows that. So give them the thing that'll give them that success, that win,
Yeah.
and then throw something that scares them right
Yeah.
after.
Because
So
I think too, it kind of puts them in a position of, and this goes with all of these strategies, it puts them in a position of, um, if you just start with with like the hard thing that they feel like they've never seen before,
Mhm.
it's overwhelming. And then
Yes.
I also think it becomes a lot more challenging to think back to like what prior knowledge do I have that can help me with this.
Yes.
Whereas when we start them with something that they know, they get like that boost of confidence and excitement. It reduces, like you said, the math anxiety, and it kind of is already putting them in that position to bring in knowledge that they have to then
Exactly.
apply it to the next thing. And
Yeah.
so I think this is why it's so important for us. And I'm so glad you had us talk about this. I think this is why it's so important for us to, as upper elementary educators, think back to how this strategy was used previously so that we
Yes.
can start students there. That doesn't mean spend all day there. It means just give them that quick win
Mhm.
and then move on to applying it to whatever the grade level expectation is, um, you know, for whatever you're teaching.
Yeah, and you said something really key there. Don't spend all day there because that is something
Right.
we tend to do also. We wanna, reintroduce that prior knowledge and bring out that prior knowledge, but then it becomes a whole lesson. And we don't want to do that, right? So we want to make that's why those formative assessments are super important because then we already know what the students are coming in with, and then we can kind of gauge from there. But you're totally right. We don't want to be there forever, right? Because then it becomes a whole other lesson. And we don't want to do that. So
Exactly. Yes.
yeah,
So
absolutely.
going back to these, what are we
Yes.
calling these? Are
These
we
are
calling them
procedural
strategies? Autom-
automaticity. Yeah, they're
Automaticities. There
basically
we go.
yeah, they're the procedural automaticities that students should have in place, basically. So the foundational pieces as
Yes.
far as when it comes to procedural, automaticity, what we want them to kind of have down packed. We did talk about breaking apart, for 10 because 10 is a benchmark,
Mhm.
well as decomposition. But oh dear, you talked about 25, which is good. But we're missing 15 and 30, and that is in this book and it is very highlighted. There are a ton of activities. There are activities in this chapter. There are a lot of activities in the companion books as well. We do not gloss over 15 and 30s as benchmarks as well. Those are super important. And I think we do a good job spending decent amount of time on the benchmark of 25,
Huh?
especially when we're talking about quarters, not physical quarters in the money sense, but as far as fractions and things like, we introduce quarters in a variety of ways. But 15s and 30s, I don't think, in my opinion, from what I've seen, we just don't hit those as much as we should. And they're really considered benchmarks as well,
Yeah.
because there's a lot of patterns in there that students should be picking up
Hmm.
with that.
Yeah. So
Um,
this is so interesting to me because if I were to, somebody were to be like, okay, what are the 8 automaticities? I don't think I would have come up with 15 and 30 as one on like by myself if I were just in my own brain thinking about this. But then seeing it on paper and seeing the reasoning for it, I'm like, of course. Like I
yeah.
just, and I think it's actually interesting. I'm kind of grouping 25s and 15s, 30s here.
Yes.
So 15s
Yes.
and
Yep.
30s, super smart because of time. That makes so much sense. But even 25s, I think I have a wondering if like the benchmark of 25s is going to be it's going to be not harder, but like there's going to have to be more of an emphasis on it in the classroom because students aren't naturally getting that experience with 25s in life outside the classroom as much. Like, I don't think my child has ever seen us pay we don't have cash ever. So I don't even think
Yeah. Same
he doesn't
girl.
have that everyday experience with it, which kind of means,
Absolutely.
that we are going to have to, there's going to be a little bit more of a lift in the classroom, is my thinking. But 15s and 30s, I was like, yeah, that makes so much sense when we're talking about like, we've got to be somewhere in 15 minutes and 30
Yeah.
minutes. Like that should be something that students are automatic with.
Yeah. It ties in perfect with time, like you said. And you don't really need to, I mean, we address analog clocks in schools, but, outside of school, students are still dealing with 15s and 30s,
Hmm.
regardless if they're looking at digital or not. But you're absolutely right. 25 is very difficult to bring in that real world experience because you can talk about coins and money all day. but really everything's digital. And, so it's about kind of tying in then what can I apply here from the real world that I can kind of bring into this. Um, and geometry is a great way to do this as well, believe it or not. So it's not just tied into money or, fractions, but geometry is a big piece. Something that I love to do with students is, I mean, you're familiar with number talks, but photo number talks. And that is just one of the best ways that you can possibly tie in, because then they're looking at it in a visual format as opposed to an abstract thing where this coin represents 25, right?
Yeah.
They can see it in like more of a visual format. Like, if there's this amount of windows or this, I love to bring in murals, right? And then I mean, I just take pictures randomly of everything everywhere and somehow make it a photo number talk. But it's a great way to kind of tie in the 25s in that sense as well. So it's just about thinking a little bit outside of the box. Again, there are a ton of activities in here where students can practice and play with the 25, but if you're thinking about, real world outside, you have to be a little bit creative in how you bring that in for sure.
Yeah. Well, and
Yeah.
so you were talking about geometry, and so I'll go the measurement route. That was one of the other things that they said about that 15 and 30 is, and it's not just 15 and 30, right? It's 60
Yeah.
and it's 90. And
Angles,
talking
yeah.
about angles, because
Angles, yeah.
we have 90-degree angle, 360
Mhm,
degrees is around. And my favorite activity from this chapter was
mhm,
on page 113, and it's that combinations activity. And
mhm.
when I wrote this down, I wrote in the margin, I was like, love this game. Oh, there we go. Love this game. I was like, we need to do this with fractions and decimals. But I also think you can do this with like giving students angle wedges and they're drawing
Absolutely.
them. And like maybe it's to make a 90-degree angle. And so you've got different
Mhm.
angles or different like benchmarks, and they are those combinations to make whether it's the 90 or 180 or 45.
Yeah.
So that's that that activity is so versatile.
Yeah, and the combination of those angles, because I love that activity, but even saying, "All right, I have 2 30-degree angles and I want to combine them. What would that look like?" Right? So then they're really kind of working on the pattern of, a 15, what did I say, 15 or 30? Whatever the angle was that I said, combining it and then seeing what new angle that makes. So yeah, I mean, you can play with this so much, there's a variety of ways. So those benchmarks are really important. 25, 15, 30. We can't lose sight of that. It's not just
Yes.
10, even though we have a base 10 system.
Yeah. Okay. I want to add on to that real quick. So it's interesting talking about measurement, or not measurement conversions. I was just reviewing a video this morning about that. Angle measurement. When students get to, it's a fourth grade standard, when they have the missing angle and
Yes,
they've got to figure out like what it is, really, that is just a missing add-in problem. Like
absolutely.
that's
Yeah.
all it is. And when students have this automaticity with 15s and 30s and really just
Mhm.
number sense in general, like
Yeah.
that becomes a much less challenging, like that's a standard that usually has fourth grade teachers like pulling their hair out.
Yeah.
And when we see that it is that missing, when they understand angles and they have this like number sense and recognize that it's a missing add-in problem,
Mhm.
that standard becomes a lot more like approachable for students and
Easier,
teachers.
for sure. And it goes back to not just the 15 and 30 benchmarks, but decomposition,
Mhm.
right? Because it's really when you're finding a missing add-in of any sort, it's really just a decomposition. If I have this number and I know that this missing part, well, what can the other missing part possibly be? Again, exactly what we're talking about. We're addressing it in upper elementary, but it's getting hit on in lower elementary. And that's why I feel like love my lower elementary teachers because they are the foundation to all of this. So any way that schools can support them makes the whole
Mhm.
flow of curriculum of whatever you have in place so much more attainable for the students. We reduce a lot of math anxiety if students are seeing something consistently across grade levels. They're
Yeah.
decomposing in kinder, up second grade, up to fifth. They're just decomposing different things. So it's important to have, we always kind of focus on our curriculum and kind of like our grade level. Sometimes we look ahead to see like, okay, what do the kids need later? Let me kind of prep them a little bit for that. but we got to look past as well. It really is that, that alignment, always focusing on vertical and horizontal alignment, right?
Yeah. And
So,
there is such a great book. It's The Math Pact, which
yes.
I
Yeah.
have talked about that book before, but I even think with some of these, granted, not these, we're talking about automaticities here, but what you just said brought me back to I guess it would be like the seven strategies. Even just having alignment on like what we are calling these strategies as well
Yes.
from grade to grade, like that is such
Mhm.
an easy way to get to help. We don't need to add complexity by
Mhm.
every grade level calling these strategies something different. And students
Yeah,
are like, wait, this
absolutely.
is a new strategy. And it's like, no, it's the same thing you've been doing since kindergarten. So
Mhm.
just a thought there in the
Yeah.
alignment of even just teachers seeing we are doing this across grades. Let's get on the same page with, this representation is a great representation to use. And if and I just did a post the other day about number bonds and how we use those
Mhm.
in kindergarten all the way up through fifth grade. And it's like just
Yeah,
having something that is the same
that
so that we can,
commonality.
yeah, that commonality there. That's what I was thinking. That commonality so that the like difficulty with numbers is not
Mhm.
compounded with like difficulty with a new name and a new representation and
Yes,
like,
yes, yes. But what we like to do is we like to give it cutesy names too. So we have to be mindful of, we want it to be math vocabulary, right? Where students kind of can be consistent with along the way. We want to make sure we're not giving it cutesy little names every year, a different one, because it
right.
really just exists as students. So I know some math vocab is harder to kind of touch on with the younger guys, and I get that. But if there's a way to kind of, bridge that in order for it not to be way off as they go through the grade level. So you're totally right. They need that consistency in the name of these strategies as well.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
absolutely.
Okay, let's dive into the last four. So we've got doubling and halving. What are your thoughts on those two?
Oh my goodness, girl. This is one of my favorite strategies. I don't care where I am, presenting wise. I could be talking about something completely different. I find a way to talk about doubling and halving in it. I will always find a way. Luckily, this chapter already has it, so I didn't have to like do that. Um, Doubling and halving, it's so underrated. It is so underrated. It is actually, unfortunately, every school has a different set of state standards, right? Or, county, district standards. Not everybody does a Common Core, and I understand that. However, the commonality that I've seen in all the curriculums that I've studied and all the places that I've worked with, um, doubling is addressed very early on in standards, not really talked about much later on, and then eh, we kind of lose it. Basically, we don't touch upon it enough. This is actually one of my favorite strategy. I know that decomposition and making I know that's foundation, but that's also thrown in your face everywhere with every standard all over the
Right.
place. But doubling and halving is one of the most, I think, in my opinion, important things to have students have down for number sense in particular, right? It is not enough to just know 6 plus 6. It's just not, right? We have to be able to incorporate that doubling and halving because it helps with multiplication and division, and not basic multiplication and division. I'm talking about extended multiplication and division. You know what I mean? There are some things, something that drives me crazy is when I see a multiplication problem that is something, let's say 13 times 2, and students are taking out a pencil and paper for that. I'm not saying pencil and paper is not good, but there are some things that we can just think about cognitively, mentally, do
Yeah.
some mental math on that. It's just doubling a thing, you can use a bunch of different strategies to get that answer, of course, but at what point can we just possibly do that mentally? It's the same thing when it comes to division. We should be able to see numbers and half that, and then it deals with other concepts that I don't think we realize. Doubling and halving is very important to things like even and odd. It's very easy to do an even and odd lesson with students and have them concentrate on what those two things are. But are we applying that when it comes to computational strategies? I don't think we do that enough. I think we do even and odd lessons. This is what even and odd numbers look like. But knowing if a number is even or odd helps you think about what strategies do I want to use to compute? Because this is probably going to give me a remainder. and then maybe I don't want to do that. So again, like the doubling and halving it ties into all these other things that's really important. And I do think it needs to transition to more of a mental math skill within reason, because some numbers, I mean, they're going to drive us crazy trying to double or half them. So obviously within reason. But it's something that I think that I push teachers the most in this area,
Yeah.
as adults for themselves, because I don't think we double and half enough. So then we kind of, I, I don't think it's purposefully, but tend to avoid it in our classroom, right?
Yeah. So,
Really try to build that within adults first and then
yes.
have them running through life, doubling and halving as much as they can to bring it into their rooms later.
I think that this was a strategy that like just a skill that I owned until my adult life. And I
Hmm.
think one of the reasons I love doubling and love halving is because, and actually I've talked about this like every single week in the book study. I love this the conversation that comes up around students actually using like multiple strategies or using like an automaticity and then changing their strategy to like carry out the problem. And I think doubling and halving oftentimes gets us to a point where the problem we are working with, doubling and halving can actually make it a little bit easier for us to do. And so I'll give
Yeah.
you an example. So my son, he just finished first grade and he's like really curious about multiplication. Um,
Yes.
Granted, I know that like standards, it's in third grade, whatever, but he's just curious about it. And so we were looking at this. It was an array, and it was 3 times 6. So it was, you know, 6 rows of 3. And he is not like super fluent with like skip counting by threes yet. And so he was like 3, 6, 9, and then he didn't know what the next one was. He saw 9 here and 9 here, and he was like, oh, I'll just essentially what he did was like double and half, right?
Double.
Because
Yeah.
yes, he was like, oh, well, I can just do like 9 plus 9, and that's easier because then he used make a 10 strategy to figure out what 9 plus 9 was. And so I think that it's like, it's situations like that where it's like we having that skill of doubling and halving allows us to make problems maybe just like more manageable for us to compute mentally.
Yeah, and it falls back to one of the components of fluency, which is efficiency, right? Efficiency is really all about selection. That's all that is, right? Are they selecting? We can solve any problem with any strategy, mostly. Most every problems with every strategy, right? But this is where efficiency falls into place. When there is a problem that you can solve any which way, but the most efficient way would be a doubling and halving, by students not having that ability or lacking that strategy, it's really hindering them, right? Because we're focusing on getting students to be more efficient and letting them select something that makes the most sense for that, problem. That's where doubling and halving can come in and actually help students. And again, they build confidence in that, right? Because they're building their mental math skills as well with that. It's interesting when I'm in classrooms and students are first kind of approaching doubling and halving, they are gassed up. They love this. So they'll come up to me and they'll be like, Miss Serrano, guess what? 11 and 11. I can double it. So it's like they get so excited. They throw out these random numbers and I'm like, all right, what is it? Go for it. Especially when they halving is a lot harder than doubling. It's almost like we see subtraction is a little bit more difficult for students than addition. Halving is a little bit more difficult than doubling. But they really get pumped up when they can do it, right? They just think that they're these superstars, and they are, because it's a skill that it's kind of being picked up on more recently than in the past, like with our traditional textbooks and things like that. So,
Yeah. And something that you said made me think about there's a quote on page, let me find it. Um, Actually, I think I wrote it down. It is, oh, on page 110. I can't remember if I've already said this, but something that you said made me think of this. It said, automaticity improves accuracy because the need for computing is gone, taking
mhm.
with it the potential for computational errors. And
Yes.
so while students could use like an algorithm or something to solve it,
Mhm.
they actually have maybe less potential for errors by using a strategy like doubling or halving to
Exactly.
make it a like friendlier problem to work
Mhm.
with. So I thought that was just really interesting because in the example going back with my son, like if he would have continued skip counting, because the next thing he said was like 11, and then he would
Mhm.
have skip counted from actually, I was working with a group of fifth graders who were doing this. They were skip counting things and all of their, if you mess up one skip count and then you do all of the
Yeah,
rest
it's all
correct,
off.
everything's off.
Mhm.
And so we talked about like what are some other ways that we can find these. They're working on division, so they were trying to get um, their multiples. And I was like, well, what
Mhm.
are some other ways? How can we use, like what you know about numbers and reasoning, all of that to get these rather than skip counting? So that just goes back to, again, this if we have these automaticities, actually makes the likelihood of error maybe a little bit less because there's just less room for, whether it's computational or skip counting or whatever those mistakes are.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's making sure that they have the foundational pieces in place so they can move on to things that have like that high like more cognitive demand, basically,
Yes.
right? They're not stuck on an algorithm where they could have errors and then actually see losses over wins and successes, which, you know what I mean, then
Yeah.
makes students feel a particular way. So you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Absolutely right. Yeah.
So, okay, we've got two more. So,
Okay.
fraction equivalents with fraction families.
Yes. I think we can even combine this because it's fractionally equivalents with fraction
Oh, yeah.
families. There's also the conversions between fractions, decimals, percentage, right? It really, to me, this section is all of this is foundational things that students need. And it touched upon something that we've already discussed. There's a fluidity here. This has to be seamless. So while all of these foundational pieces of procedural automaticities is important for when the students are starting off and they're younger, it really transitions to these harder math concepts that seem completely scary, but it's just more of the same. If we think of it and we have students think of it as this is just more of the same. I decompose this with whole numbers. I can decompose this with fractions. If they have a solid foundations of fractions, then they can convert things to decimals because they're not seeing this as different entities, right? And I
Hmm.
think that's what tends to happen is they feel like, okay, they understand the decimal unit, but they don't understand the fraction unit. Well, isn't just like whole numbers transitioning to decimals and decimal? I mean, they're called decimal fractions technically, right? Because they're one and the same. We just isolate the names. So the fact that they need to understand that equivalence is really important. So that's another foundational piece to this procedural fluency part is that they need to understand the equivalence of these things and then they are able to do those conversions between these things. But students need to stop seeing every math concept as it's a separate entity. And I do have to say that tends to happen because of the way curriculums or scope and sequences are set up. We tend to do things unit by unit. I have thoughts on that. Leave that for another day. When we do things unit by unit, which I understand it's part of the game, it's part of, what is thrown at us. I understand that. Spiral review needs to be hit heavy when it comes to that because it's not enough to say, well, we're going to deal with our decimal unit right now, do something else, then we're going to hit our fraction unit and expect kids to just somehow merge these things together. They really need to see that interconnectedness and they really need that spiral review and not a spiral review in the sense of a worksheet, which you can do, but spiral reviews in the sense of games, routines. This book, the companion books do a really good job with that, where it gives you centers and all of that, basically all of those resources. I know you have a ton of resources as well. Oh my goodness, you have an abundance of resources that teachers can use. But those given to students are important because it is that they can't just isolate. I'm going to learn decimals now. Remember whatever I need to got to remember, memorize whatever I need to have to memorize in order to get through this test and the unit test. And then now we're moving on to something else. And I completely removed what I learned previously because I have to focus on this thing.
Yeah.
So we have to kind of remove that mindset for students And we do that by really interconnecting these as much as we can, focusing on those equivalencies, those conversions, and talking about numbers as, you know, these are not different things. This is, again, like I said, more of the same,
Yeah.
decomposing, breaking apart 10, more of the same. We do it with whole numbers, we do it with decimals, we do it with fractions, and this is what it looks like back to back all together.
And I think that, so I think also with fractions and decimals too, like this was one that I thought was really interesting. And I had this like sense of with in upper elementary, this might be the one that has like maybe the most, I don't know if pushback's the right word, but like, because it's not technically like in the standards until sixth grade when they start actually having to convert between, because like fourth grade is when they first are introduced to decimals, but it's
Yes.
only tenths and hundredths. And
Yeah.
then even in fifth grade, we're working with decimals, but there's no converting between fractions and decimals. So I think
Yeah.
that that is sixth grade. Don't
Correct.
quote me
Yeah.
on that. But so I sense if, with us being like a 3-5 group, it's like, oh, but is that one that they really need to get now? Like, or do we wait until middle school? And I
I don't.
think that with this has to be based on understanding. We're not talking about like either memorizing these, like we're not talking about memorizing that 25 hundredths is the same as 1/4, but it's
Mhm.
more so that reasoning, and they have to be able to see and experience and visualize like, okay, this is 1/4, but
Mhm.
let's also think about like if we were to take a dollar and partition it, and I know I just talked about like kids aren't exposed to money, but if
Yeah.
we were to take
Yeah.
a dollar or something else and partition it into 4 equal parts, what would
Mhm.
be in those parts? It's 25 hundredths. So students are doing work that would allow for these connections. It just
Mhm.
has to be intentional. And it is not, I just want to make sure that I communicate that it's not this like thing that they have to memorize. It's not something that we have to
No.
avoid because it's not until sixth grade that they convert between them. It's
Exactly.
more so just connecting, being intentional to connect to different visuals, representations, things like that, so that they can make that connection and know that 25 hundredths is equivalent to 1/4.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you nailed it. I mean, we aren't addressing that until later, but the fifth grade foundation that we do is helpful for when
Mm-hmm.
students move into sixth grade and actually have to do that work. And the visualization piece that you mentioned is key. And it's key to defining what fractions and decimals are. When students physically see a tenth in decimal form and physically see a tenth, on a 10 by 10 grid, 100 grid, whatever you're deciding to use as your math manipulative and tool, when they physically see a tenth in either decimal form or fraction form, they're able to see again, wow, this is the same. This is
Yeah.
the same. It just has a different format. It doesn't really have a different name because it's the same name, but they can see how the concepts are interrelated. So they're definitely not doing those conversions that they do in sixth grade, but we lay the groundwork for those sixth
Yes.
grade teachers. So that's super
Exactly.
important. Yeah.
Yes.
So those
I
were really the fluency pieces that I'm hoping, as everyone's reading this chapter, you take away, especially doubling and halving, actually all of them, the 50, 30, they're all equally important.
You like to
But I
root
have
for the underdog. I can tell.
yeah,
Doubling
yeah,
and
yeah,
halving the
exactly.
underdog.
Yeah, exactly. I do, if it's okay, Brittany, I'd like to kind of mention some tips, if it's okay with you,
Yeah,
that I
go
really
for it.
want teachers to take away with that are in this chapter, but I hope that it's not glossed over. So I don't know what page it's on, girl. I'm gonna be honest with you, but I
That's
wrote it
okay.
down. Okay, so there are just some tips here that I hope they're takeaways for people. One is, and this is just a list. I'm just going to go through it. We don't even have to go through each one, but just keep in mind because fluency is so important. The three components of fluency are so important, and these procedural automaticities are so important. But the way we are changing the way we teach, right? So you have to kind of have some things that keep you motivated along the way because it can tend to be very frustrating when we're doing something new and we're not seeing success as educators right away. So something to keep in mind is it takes time for this to happen,
Mhm.
right? I'm throwing out that doubling and halving strategy. I'm throwing this out here left and right. It takes time for us to build our strength in that. Let alone the kids. Like, we really have to keep that in mind. It takes time. We really want to also put the spotlight on when kids are using these strategies. So when you're doing things like number sense routines, let's say in the beginning of class, highlight when students are doing this on their own, when they're working with the derived facts, when they're transitioning from phase 1 to 2, when they're transitioning from the counting to a derived. That's super important. So we want to spotlight them. We want to practice so much. And I don't mean bombard them with, I call it clerical work because it's just a stack of worksheets. You know what I mean? No one wants to do that. We don't even want to do that. I don't want a stack of worksheets coming home with me.
Right.
But getting them to practice in ways that gets them moving, that gets them talking, communicating. We know that those are keys to student learning, right? Moving, communicating, all of that.
And we
So
talk about practice all next week. Like, that is all we're talking about next week is
yeah,
practice.
exactly.
It is so important.
It's so important. And resources like this and resources like you have are great resources for teachers to take on. But the key is practice, practice, practice. And one last thing I'll say is do not gatekeep strategies. Please. One thing I do is I'm very passionate about working with multilingual students.
Yeah.
And we tend to see teaching lessons being very segregated when it comes to specific groups. I am very much an advocate of, you can't gatekeep strategies for some students and not others. Everybody should have access to all of these strategies, regardless of where you feel that they're at. Because sometimes, unfortunately, there is deficit mindset that comes into play. It's just a societal thing that has been around since forever. There's a great book to work on deficit thinking and thinking of things as a strength based model. I forget who wrote that, but there's a book on that.
Is it
Strength
Karen
Carp?
Hold on.
No.
I just shared
the wrong thing.
I just shared a post on it the other day, but of course
My
Instagram's not
books are
coming up.
downstairs, so I can't even.
It's
But
the one with the superhero on.
I don't know if that helps. It's blue. That's all I think.
Yes, it's by
right?
Beth Cobett and Karen Clark.
Yeah.
Strength-based teaching and learning in mathematics.
Yes, exactly. So that helps with kind of shifting our deficit mindset to that strength-based model. We really need to see students in that strength-based model. And we do not want to gatekeep strategies. Do not say this student cannot do doubling and halving. They're just not there. They can't do it. Like, everyone can there. So tips to take with you, because, it can get frustrating along the way and we can feel defeated along the way when things aren't going smoothly right away. So
thank you so much for sharing those tips. That is a great way to close out our reflection on chapter 5. I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. Thank you so much for joining me and just chatting about chapter 5. Thank you for the work that you did on the companion books. And this was just a great discussion around what is automaticity truly? What does it look like? How do we get there? So thank you so much.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for having me. I had a great time. I appreciate it. And I look forward to more discussions along the way.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Rosalba. I told you she was wonderful. So I look forward to being back with you live next week. We are going to be reading chapter 6, and we are almost done. We are only a few chapters away from closing out